When plantation records from the Savannah River Valley were finally unsealed in 1983, archivists discovered something that contradicted every assumption about antebellum Georgia. A single cabin on the Hartwell estate, home to a woman described in ledgers only as the Mulatto Rose, contained architectural features that defied the brutal logic of slavery. Hand-carved moldings, a brick fireplace with decorative ironwork, glass windows with curtains, and a locked trunk filled with items no enslaved person should possess. The discovery raised questions officials refused to answer for decades. What they found inside that cabin in 1851 would expose a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of Georgia society. A web of deception so intricate that 5 men would die to protect it. And a truth so disturbing that the surviving Hartwell descendants paid to have the records buried again. Before we continue with the story of Rose and the cabin that became her prison and her weapon, we need you to be part of this investigation. Subscribe to this channel, hit that notification bell, and tell us in the comments where you are listening from. Your engagement helps us uncover more forgotten mysteries like this one. Now, let us go back to a humid spring morning in Burke County, Georgia, when everything seemed perfectly ordinary. The Hartwell Plantation stretched across 2,000 acres of fertile soil along the Savannah River, 20 miles southwest of Augusta. In 1851, it was one of the most prosperous estates in Burke County, producing cotton, tobacco, and rice through the labor of 143 enslaved people. The main house stood on a solid elevation, a 2-story Greek Revival structure with white columns that caught the morning sun. Magnolia trees lined the approach, their waxy flowers perfuming the air each spring. Thomas Hartwell had inherited the property from his father in 1843. At 38, he was considered a progressive planter by his peers, which meant he preferred psychological control to the whip, though he would use violence when necessary. He kept meticulous records, attended church every Sunday, and served on the county agricultural board. His wife, Catherine, was the daughter of a Charleston merchant and brought both refinement and social connections to the marriage. They had 2 children, Richard, 14, already learning estate management, and Anne, 11, who spent her days with needlework and French lessons. The enslaved population lived in 2 rows of cabins behind the main house, each structure housing between 6 and 10 people. The cabins were identical, single rooms with dirt floors, gaps between the wooden planks that let in rain and cold, shared fireplaces made of mud and sticks. Families received weekly rations of cornmeal, salt pork, and molasses. They worked from dawn until dark during planting and harvest, slightly shorter hours in winter. Hartwell allowed them Sunday afternoons for their own purposes, which he considered generous, but one cabin stood apart. It sat at the end of the western row, separated from the others by perhaps 30 feet. From the outside, it appeared no different than its neighbors, though closer inspection revealed subtle distinctions. The wood was newer, the roof better maintained, the door hung straighter on its hinges. A small vegetable garden grew beside it, something none of the other cabins possessed. Most notable was what it lacked: the constant flow of people, the noise of children, the sounds of communal life. Only one person lived there. Rose had arrived at Hartwell Plantation in the summer of 1848, purchased at an estate sale in Augusta. The seller's ledger described her as mulatto female, approximately 18 years, housed exceptional appearance, no visible scars. Thomas Hartwell paid $8 for her, nearly 3 times the average price for a female field hand. His wife had not accompanied him to the sale. The other enslaved people noticed Rose immediately. Her skin was the color of honey in sunlight, her features delicate, her hair long and curling when not tied back. She moved with a grace that seemed cultivated rather than natural. And she could read, something that became apparent when she was seen examining the labels on medicine bottles in the main house. Her speech carried no regional accent, suggesting education or time spent among white families in a northern city. Thomas Hartwell assigned her to work in the main house initially, assisting with sewing and light cleaning. But within 2 weeks, he announced a change. Rose would live in her own cabin and perform specialized duties for the family. The nature of these duties was never clearly stated. She no longer appeared in the main house regularly. Yet she was not assigned to fieldwork. She received better clothing than the other enslaved women, fabric that suggested personal selection rather than mass distribution. Her weekly rations included items others never saw: white flour, fresh butter, coffee beans, white sugar. The whispers started within a month. Some of the enslaved women claimed they saw Thomas Hartwell visiting Rose's cabin after dark. Others said Catherine Hartwell's face had grown rigid whenever Rose's name was mentioned. The overseer, a German immigrant named Klaus Fischer, seemed to have been instructed never to enter Rose's cabin or discipline her for any reason. When one of the field hands made a crude comment about Rose within Fisher's hearing, the man received 15 lashes and was sold to a plantation in South Carolina within the week. The isolation might have been unbearable for some, but Rose accepted it with an expression that revealed nothing. She spoke rarely, and when she did, her words were measured and polite. She too ended no gatherings, formed no friendships, participated in none of the small acts of resistance and solidarity that helped the enslaved community survive. To the others, she became a ghost, a beautiful mystery who moved between her cabin and some unspoken arrangement with the master. But Rose was watching everything. She observed the plantation's rhythms. When the overseer made his rounds, when Thomas Hartwell met with neighboring planters, when Catherine Hartwell took her afternoon rest, when the household slaves gathered to gossip, she noted who held real power and who merely performed it, who could be trusted and who would betray confidence for favors. She was building a map of the estate's hidden architecture, the invisible structures of fear and control that held the system together. In her cabin at night, by the light of the oil lamp Hartwell had provided, Rose wrote in a journal she kept hidden beneath a floorboard she had carefully loosened. The journal was a dangerous possession, but Rose had learned that the most effective weapons were often the ones that seemed harmless until the moment they were needed. On the morning of April the 3rd, 1851, Catherine Hartwell did not come down for breakfast. This was unusual enough that Thomas sent one of the house slaves, an older woman named Dinah, to check on his wife. Dinah knocked on the bedroom door, received no answer, and entered to find Catherine lying in bed, her eyes open and fixed on the ceiling. She was breathing, but she did not respond when Dinah spoke her name. The doctor was summoned from Augusta, a ride of nearly 2 hours. Dr. Samuel Winthrop had attended to the Hartwell family for 15 years, He examined Catherine thoroughly while Thomas waited in the hallway, hands clasped behind his back. After 30 minutes, Winthrop emerged with an expression of professional concern. "A nervous condition," he announced, "brought on by excessive worry and perhaps improper diet. She needs complete rest, reduced stimulation, and a tonic. I will prepare." Thomas nodded, accepting this diagnosis without question. In 1851, Georgia, women's ailments were often attributed to their delicate constitutions, and physicians had learned to provide explanations that satisfied husbands without requiring deeper investigation. But that evening, after the doctor had departed and the household had settled into an uneasy quiet, Thomas made an unusual request. He sent for Rose. She arrived at the main house just after sunset. Entering through the back door as instructed, Thomas met her in his study, a room lined with books he rarely read and agricultural journals he studied carefully. He closed the door behind her. "Mrs. Hartwell is unwell," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "She requires care beyond what Dinina can provide. You have a gentle manner and a steady hand. You will attend to her during her recovery." Rose kept her eyes lowered as expected. "Yes, sir." "You understand this is a position of trust," Thomas continued. "You will sleep in the small room adjacent to her bedroom. You will see to her needs, administer her medicine, and report any changes in her condition directly to me. You will speak of this arrangement to no one." "I understand, sir." Thomas studied her for a long moment, and something flickered across his face. Calculation, perhaps, or worry poorly concealed. Catherine has been under strain. She has been saying things that are not rational. If she speaks to you of matters that seem confused or fanciful, you are not to repeat them. "Yes, sir." He dismissed her with a wave, and Rose climbed the stairs to the second floor where the family bedrooms were located. The small room Thomas had mentioned was barely large enough for a narrow bed and a washstand, but it had a window and a door that closed. Compared to the cabin, it was luxurious. Catherine Hartwell lay in her bed, her blonde hair spread across the pillow, her hands folded atop the coverlet. Her eyes were open, but they did not track Rose's movement as she entered the room. "Mrs. Hart." "Well," Rose said softly, "I am here to care for you." For a long moment, there was no response. Then Catherine's eyes slowly focused on Rose's face. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper, and what she said made Rose's blood turn cold. "He killed her. You look just like her. He killed my sister, and now he has brought you here to remind me." Rose maintained her expression of calm servitude, but her mind was racing. She had heard no mention of Catherine having a sister. The Hartwell family history, as understood by the enslaved community, included no such tragedy. "You should rest, Mom," Rose said, approaching with a cloth dampened in lavender water. "The doctor said, you need to rest." Catherine's hand shot out with surprising speed, gripping Rose's wrist. Her fingers were thin but strong, and her eyes had gained a clarity that seemed to contradict her earlier vacancy. "You do not understand," Catherine whispered urgently. "He will do the same to you. He cannot help himself. I have tried to warn others, but they put me in bed and call me hysterical. You must leave this house. You must run while you still can." Before Rose could respond, footsteps sounded in the hallway. Catherine's grip released immediately, and her expression dissolved back into blankness. Thomas entered the room carrying a glass of dark liquid. "Her medicine," he said, handing it to Rose. "See that she drinks all of it." Rose took the glass and helped Catherine sit up enough to drink. The liquid smelled of laudanum and other herbs. Catherine swallowed obediently, and within minutes her eyelids grew heavy. Thomas watched until his wife slipped into sleep, then gestured for Rose to follow him into the hallway. "As I said, she speaks irrationally. You will ignore anything she says that does not pertain to her immediate comfort. Is that clear?" "Yes, sir." Thomas descended the stairs, and Rose returned to the small room adjacent to Catherine's. She did not sleep. Instead, she sat in the darkness, listening to Catherine's steady breathing and thinking about a dead sister no one had mentioned, about Catherine's desperate warning about the way Thomas Hartwell's voice had changed when he spoke of his wife's words. Something terrible had happened in this house, and whatever it was, Catherine Hartwell believed it would happen again. The next morning, Rose began searching for answers. Rose had been taught to move through spaces without drawing attention, a survival skill cultivated over years of navigating white households where visibility could mean danger. Now, as she attended to Catherine Hartwell's needs, bringing food that went mostly uneaten, changing bedclothes, reading aloud from devotional books, she also observed everything else. The Hartwell house revealed itself in layers. The public rooms downstairs displayed careful respectability. Furniture imported from Charleston, paintings of pastoral scenes, a piano in the parlor that Anne practiced on each afternoon, but the private spaces told different stories. Catherine's bedroom contained a locked cabinet that Rose was forbidden to open. Through a gap in the door, she glimpsed what appeared to be letters tied with black ribbon. On the mantelpiece sat a daguerreotype in a silver frame, positioned so it faced the bed. The image showed two young women in identical dresses, their faces so similar they could only be sisters. One of them was clearly Catherine, perhaps 10 years younger. Her woman shared her features, but had darker hair and a more serious expression. Rose waited until Thomas had left for a meeting with his cotton factor in Augusta. Catherine was sleeping under the influence of her medicine. The house slaves were occupied with their daily tasks. Rose carefully removed the daguerreotype from its frame. On the back, in faded ink, someone had written Catherine and Louisa, Peaton, Charleston, 1839. Louisa, the sister Catherine had mentioned, Rose replaced the daguerreotype and moved to the locked cabinet. Virginia, who had been a skilled carpenter before his capture, and who had taught several of the women practical skills that white owners assumed they could never acquire. The lock was simple, designed to discourage curiosity rather than prevent determined intrusion. Inside, Rose found the letters, dozens of them, all addressed to Catherine in a flowing hand. She selected one at random and read, "Dearest sister, I write with news that will surely surprise you. Mr. Hartwell has asked Father for permission to call on me formally. You know my reservations about plantation life, but he seems a sincere gentleman, and Father believes it an excellent match. I confess some excitement despite my hesitations. Please write and tell me what you think of this development. Your loving sister, Louisa." Rose read several more letters, watching a courtship develop through careful prose. Louisa Peaton had been engaged to marry Thomas Hartwell in 1841. The letters spoke of wedding preparations, of Louisa's mixed feelings about leaving Charleston for rural Georgia, of Catherine's apparent encouragement of the match. Then the letter stopped. The final one was dated November 7th, 1841, just 2 weeks before the scheduled wedding. Louisa wrote of last minute details and her nervousness about married life. There was no indication of any problem, no foreshadowing of tragedy. Rose searched the cabinet thoroughly, but found nothing else. No letter explaining what had happened to Louisa, no obituary, no wedding announcement. It was as if the woman had simply ceased to exist after November 1841. She locked the cabinet and returned everything to its original position. Catherine was stirring, making small sounds of distress in her drugged sleep. Rose dampened a cloth and placed it on her forehead, and Catherine's eyes fluttered open. "Lua," she whispered. "No, ma'am. It is Rose." Catherine's face contorted with grief. "I should have stopped her. I should have told her what I suspected. But I wanted to believe Father when he said it would be different with me. That Thomas would not, that I would be safe because I was less beautiful than my sister." Rose leaned closer, keeping her voice gentle. "What happened to Louisa?" "Mrs. Hartwell, they said she drowned. A terrible accident. Thomas took her for a carriage ride along the river on a beautiful autumn day, and she insisted on walking near the water despite the muddy banks. She slipped and fell, and the current took her before he could reach her. They found her body 3 mi downstream, tangled in tree roots. Everyone said how tragic it was, how devoted Thomas seemed in his grief. Father believed him completely. And 6 months later, Thomas asked to court me instead." Rose felt ice forming in her stomach. "You do not believe it was an accident. I was 15 when Louisa died. I grieved for 2 years. And then when Thomas began calling on me, I found her diary. She had hidden it behind a loose brick in the fireplace of our shared bedroom. In it, she wrote about Thomas's growing possessiveness during their engagement, his jealousy when she spoke to other men, his insistence that she cut ties with her Charleston friends. She wrote that she was planning to end the engagement, that she feared him, but did not know how to refuse him without causing scandal." Catherine's voice dropped to barely a whisper. The last entry was dated November 6th, 1841. She wrote, "Tomorrow, Thomas is taking me to see the plantation lands he has purchased along the river. I will tell him there that I cannot marry him. I pray he will accept this with grace, but I fear otherwise. If anything should happen to me, let it be known that I did not go to that river willingly." "You told your father." "I tried. He said I was reading too much into a young woman's nervousness. He said Thomas had witnesses who confirmed it was an accident, that searching for conspiracy and tragedy would only cause pain. He burned the diary. Then he strongly suggested that I accept Thomas's courtship as Louisa would have wanted her sister to find happiness, and our family's finances were such that an advantageous marriage was necessary." Rose understood the implications immediately. Catherine had been sold to her sister's possible murderer to settle debts and maintain social standing. and she had lived with this knowledge for 10 years, bearing Thomas's children, managing his household, maintaining the pretense of a successful marriage. "Why are you telling me this now?" Rose asked. Catherine's eyes filled with tears. "Because you look so much like her. The same colouring, the same features. Thomas saw it immediately when he purchased you. I knew what it meant. He is creating a replacement, a version of Louisa he can control completely. One who cannot refuse him, cannot leave him, cannot threaten his image. And when he tires of you, or when you become dangerous to his reputation, you will disappear just as Louisa did." Rose wanted to dismiss this as the paranoid fantasy of a woman driven to instability by years of suspicion and fear. But she could not. She had felt Thomas Hartwell's eyes on her, had seen the way he positioned her in isolation, had noted the unusual privileges that separated her from every other enslaved person on the estate. She was not a slave in the traditional sense of the word. She was something worse, a living doll crafted to fulfill an obsession rooted in murder. Over the following weeks, Rose continued caring for Catherine, while quietly investigating the Hartwell family history. She had learned that information existed in unexpected places, and that enslaved people often knew more about white family secrets than the families themselves realized. Dinina, the older house slave who managed the kitchen, had worked at Hartwell Plantation since Thomas's father was alive. She remembered Luasicia's single visit to the estate before her death. "Pretty girl," Dinina said one afternoon as she kneaded bread dough, her GNL'd hands working with practiced efficiency. Nervous though, kept looking around like she expected something bad to happen. Master Thomas was all attention and smile, but I seen that kind of smile before my first. Dinina's hands slowed as memory took hold. "I seen that kind of smile before," she continued quietly, eyes fixed on the dough. "Back on the Calhoun place. Man smiled like honey, but trouble followed him same as flies." Rose said nothing, only listened. "He smiled like that at the girl who cooked in the big house," Dinina went on. "She lasted 2 seasons. Then one morning folks said she run off, but nobody ever runs off barefoot, leaving her shawl folded neat by the door." Rose felt the truth settle heavier in her chest. That night, she returned to Catherine's bedside with new purpose. The medicine had been reduced slightly at Rose's insistence, and Catherine's mind was clearer now, though fear still lived behind her eyes. "You must help me," Catherine whispered once Thomas had left the house for the evening. "If you do nothing, he will erase you the way he erased her." "I will not disappear quietly," Rose replied, "but I need proof, something that cannot be explained away." Catherine hesitated, then slowly nodded. "There is one thing," she said. "After Louisa's death, Thomas paid 5 men, boatmen, labourers, to swear to what they saw that day. 2 of them were already in debt to him. 1 was promised land. The others, they drank too much and talked too freely." "Where are they now?" Rose asked. Catherine's lips trembled. "Dead. All within 5 years. Fever, accidents. One fell from a loft. People said it was misfortune." She met Rose's eyes. It was silence. Rose returned to her cabin that night and lifted the loose floorboard. Her journal lay where she had hidden it, pages already thick with observations. She added new names, new dates, new questions. She began watching Thomas more closely. She noticed how he never walked near the river alone anymore, how he avoided the western bank entirely, how he burned papers late at night in the study hearth, even in summer. And she noticed something else. Once every month, Thomas rode out alone at dawn and returned before noon, his boots muddy, his mood unsettled. When Rose discreetly asked Klaus Fischer where the master went, the overseer stiffened. "You ask too many questions," Fischer muttered. "Do not do that again," which told her everything. The next Sunday, while the plantation rested, Rose followed Thomas at a distance, careful to keep trees between them. He rode toward the Savannah River, to a bend where the current slowed and debris gathered along the bank. There, half hidden by reeds and willow roots, stood the remains of an old stone marker, unmarked, weather-worn, never recorded on any map. Thomas dismounted and knelt beside it. Rose watched as he removed something from his coat and placed it at the base of the stone, a ribbon, black, faded. The same kind she had seen binding Louisa's letters. Rose understood then. Louisa Peaton had not been swept away and lost. She had been buried where no one would ever look. When Thomas rode away, Rose approached the marker. The earth around it was uneven, disturbed long ago, but never fully settled. She did not dig, not yet. Evidence needed witnesses, not suspicion. Instead, she marked the location in her mind and returned before her absence was noticed. That night, she wrote until her fingers cramped. She wrote names, dates, patterns. She wrote Thomas Hartwell's courtship of two sisters, the death of one, the silence of the other. She wrote of the privileges used as chains, of isolation disguised as favor. And at the bottom of the page, she wrote one final line: "I am not Louisa, and I will not die to preserve his illusion." Above the cabin, the night insects sang. In the big house, Thomas Hartwell slept, unaware that the woman he believed powerless was assembling the truth piece by piece. The prison he had built for Rose was becoming a trap of his own making, and soon the Savannah River would give back what it had been forced to hide. Dinina's voice trailed off, her eyes distant with memory. "I seen that kind of smile before," she continued quietly, "on a man who already made up his mind about what he gon' take, whether it given to him or not." Rose felt a chill move through her spine. "What happened?" she asked softly. Dinina glanced toward the doorway, then leaned closer. "That man's smile when he done decided somebody fate. My first master smile like that before he sold my two boys. Same smile." That night, Rose wrote everything in her journal. Names, dates, conversations. Louisa Peyton, November 1841. River. Diary burned. Replacement. She understood now why Thomas Hartwell had paid so much for her, why he had isolated her, why her cabin had been different, why he had given her privileges that separated her from the others. She was not property meant to work the land. She was property meant to replace a ghost. The pattern. Over the next month, Rose began noticing the pattern. Thomas Hartwell started visiting Catherine less. Instead, he began finding reasons to summon Rose. Small tasks at first. Bring tea to the study. Arrange papers on his desk. Read letters aloud when his eyes were tired. Always alone. Always with the door closed. He never touched her improperly. Not yet. But his gaze lingered too long. He asked questions. Where did you learn to read? Who taught you your manners? Were your parents educated? Do you remember your mother's face? And the most disturbing question of all, do you know what loyalty means, Rose? Yes, sir. It means gratitude, he said, calmly. And gratitude means silence. Catherine's decline. Catherine Hartwell grew worse. The medicine increased. More laudanum, stronger tonics, longer sleep. She began losing track of days. Sometimes she mistook Rose for Louisa. Sometimes she screamed in her sleep. Sometimes she cried and begged Rose to hide the journal. He will kill you, she whispered one night. He always kills what he cannot own completely. One morning, Dr. Winthrop returned. After examining Catherine, he spoke privately with Thomas. Rose stood outside the door and listened. She is not improving, the doctor said. In truth, she is deteriorating. The mind is breaking down. It may be permanent. Thomas's voice was cold. Then she is unfit to manage the household. Silence. What are you suggesting? Winthrop asked carefully. A long rest, Thomas replied. Perhaps a private facility in Charleston, a place for women with delicate constitutions. An asylum. Rose understood immediately. Once Catherine was gone, there would be no witness, no memory, no voice. The trunk in the cabin. That night, Rose returned to her cabin for the first time in weeks. She lifted the loose floorboard, removed the journal. Then she opened the locked trunk. Inside were items that told a story no ledger ever recorded. Newspaper clippings about Louisa Peyton's death. A copy of the Charleston Death Registry. A servant's affidavit from 1841. A river transport log. A broken locket with Louisa's portrait inside. And a sealed packet labelled, If I Disappear. Inside the packet was a confession. Not written by Catherine. Written by a carriage driver. A man named Elias Cooper. He had driven Thomas and Louisa to the river in 1841. His statement read, Mr. Hartwell ordered me away from the river bank. I heard shouting. I heard a scream. I saw Mr. Hartwell standing alone. Miss Peyton was in the water. He told me she slipped. He paid me $50 that day and said if I ever spoke of it, my family would suffer. Elias Cooper had died in 1846. Fever, according to records. Rose knew better. The conspiracy. Now she understood. This was bigger than Thomas Hartwell. Someone had helped him. Paid witnesses. Silenced servants. Burned diaries. Buried records. Erased Louisa Peyton from society. And protected Thomas's reputation. 5 men would die to protect it. The conspiracy Catherine had hinted at was real. The choice. Rose now faced a decision. Run and disappear like Louisa. Stay and become Louisa, or expose everything. But exposing a white planter in 1851 Georgia meant only one thing: death, unless she used the system against itself. She began copying documents. One set hidden under the floorboard. One set buried in the vegetable garden. One set sewn into the lining of her dress. She began making allies: a riverboat cook, a free black preacher in Augusta, a German abolitionist trader, a northern journalist visiting Savannah, and one person inside the house, Richard Hartwell, the 14-year-old son. He had begun watching her, listening, asking questions, and one night he whispered, "My mother says my father is a monster." Rose looked at him, and for the first time, she allowed her mask to slip. "He is," she said, "and one day everyone will know." By mid-May of 1851, the decision had been made. Not announced, not discussed, simply arranged. Rose learned of it the way enslaved people always learned dangerous truths: by listening when white voices assumed no one worthy of notice was nearby. Thomas Hartwell stood in the front hall with Dr. Winthrop and a stranger in a grey coat. The man's boots were too clean for a farmer, his hands too soft for labour. "Charleston," Rose guessed. "A private institution," the stranger was saying. "Exclusively women, families of standing, complete discretion." "And visitors?" Thomas asked. "Discouraged, letters monitored, for the patient's own good." Thomas nodded once. "She will go quietly?" "With the correct dosage," Dr. Winthrop replied. Rose felt her chest tighten. They were going to erase Catherine Hartwell. The sedation. That evening, Rose was instructed to administer a new tonic. Thicker, darker, bitter, even through the glass. "Double the usual amount," Thomas said. "She must rest." Catherine's eyes found Rose's. She knew. As Rose lifted the glass, Catherine's fingers brushed hers, light, deliberate. "Do not let him win," she whispered. Rose hesitated. Then she made her choice. She poured only half the dose into Catherine's mouth. The rest she spilled into a folded cloth hidden in her sleeve. Catherine fell asleep, but not into the heavy oblivion Thomas expected. The carriage. 2 days later, before dawn, the carriage arrived. No neighbours, no church farewell, no children present. Richard was sent away on an errand. Anne was kept in her room. Thomas supervised everything. Catherine was wrapped in blankets, pale but conscious, her eyes searching desperately. As they carried her down the stairs, Rose walked beside them. Thomas watched closely. "Make sure she has everything she needs," he said. Rose met his gaze. "Yes, sir." At the carriage door, Catherine's hand slipped from the blanket. A scrap of paper fell. Thomas didn't see it. Rose did. She stepped on it, hiding it beneath her shoe. The carriage rolled away. Catherine Hartwell vanished from Burke County. The note back in her cabin, Rose unfolded the paper. 3 words, written shakily. The river path. Rose closed her eyes. Louisa. The river. The place where accidents happened. The first death. 3 nights later, Klaus Fischer, the overseer, did not return from his evening rounds. They found him at dawn, near the river bank, his skull crushed, his pockets empty, his body arranged too carefully to be chance. Thomas Hartwell stood over the corpse, face pale. "A robbery," he said immediately. "River men." But Rose noticed something else. Mud on Fisher's boots. Not river mud, cabin mud. Fisher had been to Rose's cabin that night. For the first time. Someone had broken Thomas's rule. And paid for it. The trap tightens. Fear spread through the plantation. Thomas doubled the patrols, restricted movement, questioned everyone. When he summoned Rose, she came calmly. "You know nothing of this?" he asked. "No, sir." He studied her carefully. "You were close to my wife. I served her. She spoke to you. Only prayers and confusion." His eyes narrowed. "People disappear when they become inconvenient," he said softly. "You understand that." "Yes, sir." But inside, Rose was counting. 1 man dead, 4 to go. The hidden network. Within a week, Rose sent word out. The riverboat cook carried a note sewn into a sack of cornmeal. The preacher in Augusta received copies of the affidavit. The German trader memorized names and dates, then burned the paper. The journalist delayed his return north, and Richard Hartwell began secretly bringing rose books from his father's study. Law, property, inheritance. "How can a man lose everything?" Richard asked. Rose answered honestly. "When the truth is louder than his power." The return from Charleston. Late one night, a letter arrived, not addressed to Thomas, addressed to Rose. The seal bore the mark of the Charleston Asylum. Inside, a single line written in a trembling hand. "They are poisoning me. I have little time. Trust no one but the river." Rose stared at the words until the oil lamp burned low. Catherine was alive, but not for long, and Thomas Hartwell was running out of time.